like kiwi, but if kiwi were somehow blue. People sometimes ask us, how do you get the apples and pears into the wine? First of all, wine is made from grapes. There are no apples and pears in the wine. But the chemical compounds present in a wine can often mimic the flavors and aromas of specific fruit, flowers, botanicals, even things like butter, bacon, gasoline, or leather. There's real science behind the reason that a group of tasting professionals can all blind taste the same wine and come up with the exact same markers. At Winecraft, we generally taste our way through 6 glasses of wine, but today I'm going to try to give you tasting basics in the time it takes me to drink this glass of Cazzatali. First off, blind tasting isn't actually blind, which is good for people like me who don't consider themselves talented or natural tasters. I need all the clues I can get. So we start, when we're evaluating a wine, with looking at its appearance. Hold your glass against a white background. Usually a piece of paper will do. Most white wines actually reside within the realm of straw or pale yellow, depending on your common vocabulary. But if you look closely, you can sometimes catch hints of other things. For example, silver or pink could give us a clue what type of grape this is, whereas green often means that the wine is young. Now, if your wine starts to veer more into the territory of bright yellow or even gold, amber, brown, this also tells us things. Yellow could mean it came from a sunny climate, whereas gold kind of hints at oak and or oxidation. When wines get really, really deeply developed, they get darker in color. Red wines tend to drop color as they age. On the topic of red wines, they normally exist within the realm of ruby or purple. Look to see if your wine is a little bit more red or a little more blue. Wines that look a little more red generally have higher acid and or come from a cooler climate, whereas wines that look a little more blue have lower acid and may come from a warmer climate. We can also ask ourselves, is the wine transparent, translucent, or opaque? Opaque means I can't see my hand through it. Transparent, I can read. If a red wine is more transparent, that generally comes from a thinner skinned grape, like Pinot Noir. If it's opaque, that generally comes from a thicker skinned grape, like Cabernet Sauvignon. Other things we can look for is the wine cloudy or clear. Haziness in wine can be a fault, but it could also just mean that the wine wasn't fined or filtered. Tells us something about the winemaking. Finally, if we give it a little swirl, and you don't have to swirl it to death, we see these sheets that kind of form into tears and run down the side of the glass. If those tears are slow to form and slow to fall, that could mean high residual sugar or high alcohol. If they form really fast and disappear just as fast, that's generally a lighter bodied wine with less alcohol and or less residual sugar. The most important thing to remember about appearance is that wine are like people. You can't judge them strictly on appearance, and you can't take one piece of information and run to the bank with it. It just gives us some clues and maybe piques our interest a little bit. Now let's take a sniff. For me, the first thing I do is make note of any floral or botanical notes that I get. The reason I do that is because those are usually the things that hit me first, and I want to go ahead and check that box before moving on to the fruit profile. Examples could be orange blossom in Muscat, lemongrass in Sauvignon Blanc, lavender in Grenache, roses in Nebbiolo. There's a couple different markers that are specific to certain grapes. Sometimes all I'll get is white flower and I just can't get more detailed than that, and sometimes that's the wine and sometimes that's me. The other thing I'll do is make note of anything else that jumps out at me in the glass, no matter what category of aroma it comes from. We do that for two reasons. One, because that could be a very big clue to the identity of the wine, but we're also going to have to tuck it away so that it doesn't distract us from the other things that the wine is trying to tell us. Now, the fruit profile, when it comes to deductive tasting, sometimes gets a bad rap. The reason I think is because many white wines share the same fruit profile, and so do many red wines. So you're not going to be able to nail the wine by fruit alone. However, when it comes to tasting for appreciation, it is one of the most enjoyable aspects of the wine, so we're going to spend a minute on it. For white wine, I like to start with families of fruit, specifically citrus, tree fruit, that's basically apples and pears, stone fruit, and finally melon and tropical. From there, zoom in. If I'm getting citrus, is it lemon? Is it lime, orange, tangerine? Now let's see if we can get even more precise. Meyer lemon, key lime, mandarin orange. In order to do this, we need to practice a lot, but we also need from the wine an expressiveness and a quality to it. Initially, red wine seems simpler. Is it throwing more red fruit or is it throwing more black fruit? Red fruit could be strawberry, cranberry, raspberry. Black fruit is more like black plum, black raspberry, black currant, blackberry. While we're meditating on fruit, we also want to think about the part of the fruit that we're detecting. Is it the flesh, the rind, the zest, the pith? That's the little white part in between. But even more important than the types of fruit and the parts of fruit, what we really need to pay attention to, I think, is the condition of the fruit. The fruit could be underripe, it could be tart, it could be fresh, ripe, overripe, and then you even get into things like baked, stewed, jammy. These are definite indicators of the climate that this wine came from. So now we can start to drill down on the types of regions that we're considering. The next thing I turn my attention to is a category that's usually referred to pretty unimaginatively as other. These are things that aren't fruit, they're not floral, but they're not earth or wood either, because those we're going to talk about next. These could be things like yellow lentil, bacon dripping, wet sheepdog. These things are very unusual and they're usually very distinct. They are the things, more so than anything else, that are going to really let us hone in on what this wine might be. One of the key things to always ask yourself when drinking a wine, has this wine been aged in oak? What do we look for? Basically, you're going to want to check for things like vanilla, baking spice, cinnamon, nutmeg, the kind of things that show up in your pumpkin spice latte. Sometimes the aromas and flavors are even a little bit more aggressive. Think coconut or even dill. That's the stuff that you use to garnish your smoked salmon. A number of factors contribute to the wood signature of a wine, and it takes lots and lots of practice to begin to pull them out. For example, the type of oak that's used. Generalization alert, American oak tends to be a little bit more assertive, whereas European or French oak tends to be a little bit more subtle. There's also the age of the oak. Only new oak barrels impart the types of flavors and aromas that we're talking about. Used oak imparts oxygen, which will also have its own markers, but it doesn't really impart flavor. So from that, we're going to get a little bit of nuttiness and a little bit of a rounder feel to the wine, a little bit harder to detect. Finally, there's the size of the barrel. This may seem counterintuitive when you start, but the smaller the barrel, the more oak influence. So larger barrels, the surface area of wood to wine is actually less than in a smaller barrel. So that's how wine math works. Oh, and finally, there's the level of toast. or char that happens when the barrel is made. Initially, a little bit of toast is going to create more vanillin, which is the compound that is directly responsible for giving us that vanilla aroma and flavor. However, more intense char, it's actually going to pull back. It's going to be a little bit of less vanillin. Now let's turn our attention to a couple of other winemaking techniques besides oak aging that will leave a telltale clue in the glass. One is carbonic maceration, which is most commonly associated with Beaujolais. It is intracellular fermentation, which I will explain up there. And what it does is leave us with a lot of cherry berry aromas and sometimes a little hint of bubblegum or banana. Then there is malolactic fermentation, or malolactic conversion if you prefer. That is where we're going to take the tart malic acid and convert it, or allow it to be converted, to kinder, gentler, creamier lactic acid. It often gives us a note of butter or cream on the nose and on the palate. Then there's aging sur lie, or aging on the lees. Lees are just dead yeast. That's all they are. During fermentation, when the yeast are consuming all the sugar and converting it to alcohol, at some point they kind of eat themselves to death and they fall to the bottom of the vessel. Now the winemaker can either minimize that contact or actively allow it, or even encourage it by stirring the lees up from time to time. Now what that's going to do is impart a biscuity or brioche kind of note to the wine. I think it's one of the most complex flavors and aromas that there is. Sometimes it expresses itself as Parmesan rind or even sour cream and onion. Finally, the last thing we have to check for on the nose is the presence, or lack thereof, of earth or mineral. For a change, let's make our life simple. Earth is organic, something that was once alive. Think about potting soil or forest floor. Whereas mineral is something that is inorganic. It was never alive, like crushed gravel, wet rocks, things of that nature. Major generalization alert. Generally, Old World wines, the wines from Europe, tend to exhibit far more earth and mineral than New World wines, wines from not Europe. Okay, finally we get to taste. Now, the first thing I'm doing is kind of revisiting everything that I thought I got on the nose to see if I pick it up on the palate. Does it move to the back? Does it come to the fore? Do I get anything new? The other thing I notice is what changed. For me, if it's an acidic wine, that acid will act like this big sort of neon highlighter on the fruit. And usually what that does is it brightens it or tartans it up for me. So if I said, well, the condition of the fruit on the nose was fresh or ripe, it might be tart when I taste. You can pick up additional things while tasting. It's one of the reasons that a lot of us do that weird slurpy thing. What we're actually trying to do is, one, hold the wine in the mouth so that it warms up. When the wine warms up, generally it reveals itself a little more. And the other thing is to introduce it to air. We're basically aerating the wine in the mouth, which allows us to not only, again, pick up additional aromas and flavors, but also to experience the wine retronasally, which is just a way of saying in the nose by way of the back of the throat. So the secret's out. Most of tasting is actually accomplished by sniffing. However, there is another major aspect to tasting wines, and that is determining the structure of a wine. A lot of us have heard this term before, and we may or may not fully embrace what it really is. Sometimes people describe structure as the backbone of the wine, or sides of a box that sort of hold it up. I like that. I like to describe structure, though, as the things that you feel more so than you taste. So this is going to be the tactile sense of a wine that you get. The key components to structure are acid, tannin, sugar, alcohol, and body or mouthfeel. Acids give wine its complexity and mouth-watering character. It's actually going to make you drool. Acids are present in grapes at the start of fermentation, things like tartaric and malic acid, but some acids are also produced during fermentation, such as malic acid. Tannins can be confused with acids, but don't get confused because they're actually the opposite. They're going to dry your mouth out. You're suddenly going to be aware of the fact that you have gums. Tannins are present in the skins, the seeds, and the stems of the grapes, as well as the oak in which the wine is aged. For this reason, red wines can have acid and often have tannin as well, whereas white wines often have different levels of acidity, but rarely have tannins. Sugar and alcohol also kind of exist on the same spectrum. At harvest, the grapes are going to have a certain amount of sugar. That sugar is either going to be converted to alcohol via fermentation, or if the winemaker chooses to halt fermentation at some point during the process, a certain amount of residual sugar will remain. This determines whether the wine is dry or sweet. Generally, unless it's fortified, a wine is going to have high alcohol or higher residual sugar. Because remember, those things exist on a spectrum. The riper the grapes are at harvest, the more potential residual sugar or alcohol is in the finished wine. The less ripe the grapes are, the lower the potential sugar or alcohol will be in the finished wine. Body in wine is often compared to that of milk, whereas whole milk would be akin to a fuller-bodied wine, skim milk would be similar to a lighter-bodied wine. It's just a way to think of it when you hold the wine on your palate. The things that contribute to body are often things like residual sugar or alcohol in the finished wine. That's going to be a fuller-bodied wine. There are also decisions made during winemaking, like lees aging and oak aging, that are going to contribute to the perception of body in the finished wine. Conversely, the presence of acidity in the wine is going to lessen the perception of body. It's going to be a lighter, more refreshing experience. We've talked about this before. Quality in wine is whatever wine you like, and that can also be a very personal and subjective thing. However, when we talk about wines in general in the wine community, we have to come up with some sort of way to quantify something that is so difficult to pin down. So the things that we'll look for in a wine to determine whether it is a quality wine versus a lesser quality wine would be things like balance, complexity, concentration, and finish. Let's break these down. When we talk about complexity, we're talking about how much is there to think about or discuss in this wine. How many different categories of descriptors could we pinpoint? If this were a movie, is it a popcorn flick, or is it something that we want to go out and discuss afterwards? When we talk about balance, was there one particular characteristic that kind of drowned out the others that might have been there and had something to offer? Like that guest at the dinner party that speaks too loudly. Concentration or intensity is associated with quality because it often has to do with yield, which is the amount of grapes that a vine produces or doesn't. For now, let's think about it as how the wine speaks to you. Does it speak to you compellingly, or is it in the corner on its cell phone? Does it express itself to you right out of the glass without even taking a sip? Or do you have to work for it a little bit harder? Did you know that even if you're spitting, a quality wine can linger on your palate longer than a minute? For the purposes of this conversation, let's think about wine as a first date. Is it the kind of date that you can't get out of your head long after it's ended? Or did we already friend zone this wine and move on? Not all wines have to be all things. It is perfectly acceptable to enjoy a simple wine. However, if we're going to continue down this path of qualifying or quantifying quality, if we can say hell yes to any one of these categories, the wine is considered acceptable. 2, it's good. 3, it's very good. And if we can say absolutely to all 4, we have an outstanding wine on our hands. The next step for deductive tasters would be to form a final conclusion based upon the clues that the wine has given us. But for aficionados, let's talk about what we liked, what we didn't. That's how we start to build a profile of a wine that we may not have discovered yet, but are destined to love. One of the things I love about tasting wine, whether deductive or appreciative, is that it forces me to focus on what's in the glass, not my problems, my dog's problems, deadlines, or the obscene amount of laundry I have to do. Now, there are plenty of other ways to achieve this, but drinking wine is definitely one of the most enjoyable. Try it.